Hey there, welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this is a big one, the newest project from Billy Woods, Gollywog. I've said before, when I reviewed the excellent Hiding Places in 2019, that it's always tempting to overthink a Billy Woods or Armand Hammer review. They're often jam-packed with so much context and detail and intricate flair that if you're not digging into every dusty crawl space, you feel like you're missing part of the message. But then I think about my favorite moments in his catalog, and while the dense wordplay is always going to be there, it's the startling downbeat frankness of the scene, a reality we kind of know but don't want to acknowledge. Those are the pieces that dig the deepest. As such, it's placed me in a bit of an odd space when it comes to my fandom of Billy Woods. Most starkly in 2022, when in comparison with the dense, high-concept exploration of the African diaspora and systemic decay on Ethiops, I've always been drawn to the hazy, deeply vulnerable narratives of church. And thus 2023's Maps with Kenny Siegel felt a little like an outlier for Woods, a travelogue record that's easily the most accessible in his catalog in terms of conventional song structure and autobiographical stories, but I also knew in my gut that was never gonna last. Hence we have Gollywog, named after a racist doll caricature. Let's be real, it's an outright slur, I'm kind of uncomfortable saying it, where each song was reportedly self-contained, atomized vignettes of horror with some interconnecting time travel to leap across the scenes. And it's also naturally his most critically acclaimed album to date, so I wasn't quite sure where I would fall with it, and look, I'll admit this review took longer than I was predicting to fully digest this album. And while I could add my usual caveat that Billy Woods often intentionally resists the easy analysis, he even seems to say it himself on multiple tracks here. He has also said in interviews he wants every one of his projects to force the audience to confront something within themselves in some deeper manner. And while I've got a level of familiarity with Billy Woods' writing for nearly a decade now, I'm a little harder to surprise. It's very telling that right from the first track, appropriately named Jumpscare with its nursery rhyme melody before it grinds out, he describes that simply through rapping in English, he's using the language of the master to then subvert and challenge that violence, because language can be violence. And Billy Woods' pedigree as a writer shows how much that can matter, something I'm well aware of as a critic, at least until it doesn't, and we will come back to that. What you will recognize immediately is that the titular doll only shows up a couple of times on the album, but in truth, it doesn't really have to, in order to amplify the paranoia of otherwise diffuse and scattered scenes both across time and space. What's important to highlight is that said doll historically was a caricature, but it is still held as a children's toy within certain European colonial powers today, with a lot of, oh, it's not that bad, why are you taking it so seriously, just let what it was end. But Billy Woods recognizes what that is, and it ties into one of the most graphic and consistent metaphors across the album: amputation, cutting off parts of yourself to survive. Note the juxtaposition on Maquiladoras, which translates to factory, beyond the quaking stutter, the static and somber pianos, between al.divino's street-level inhumanity and Billy Woods speaking about the black Marxist political philosopher Frantz Fanon's thoughts on self-amputation, where it's cast in gory visuals of the CIA coaxing his rescue from Africa as his handlers, but it's referring to more to how one splits themselves from humanity and their culture in order to survive, where the translated song title becomes cruelly ironic, even if the horn echoing at the end has the words, "Time is on my side." We'll also come back to that. It also gets even more stark earlier on the album with one of the most discussed tracks, Corinthians. Produced by LP with the warping futuristic synths, it highlights the gratuitous waste of the genocide over Gaza perpetuated by Israel and by extension the American government, which the psychedelic warp of Counterclockwise directly references in the torture testimony samples in the outro. And for what? When the billionaires aren't getting their escape, either to Mars or before God, so as implied by the Diary of a Madman samples that bookend that song, amidst decorum and righteousness, they become cannibals. They eat each other. And that purposeful removal of humanity and consumption of oneself comes up on BLK XMAS, where after Bruiser Wolf sets the stage against the uncanny piano line, Billy Woods talks about a family close by getting evicted before Christmas, and then the neighbors picking at their leftover belongings in the streets. And he does the same, only for said objects to rot as he brings them home, and yet he sees those outside for waiting for him for the exact same fate, which echoes later in the layered nightmares of Cold Sweat, where against a similar stalking piano, he keeps waking through scenes where the dread accumulates before waking to the reality of his landlord trying to throw him out for bullshit reasons, which at least in the moment he's got the money and autonomy to stop. But again, he's aware of how fragile any of this power truly is, especially coming through his speech. Arm & Hammer's Haram was all about trying to keep their communication open but also secret, with some success amidst bad systems, and We Buy Diabetic Test Strips a couple years later highlight just how said communication can be missed or fail, which is why Wood says on Make No Mistake Against the Graceful Melodic Flutter, while he never lies on a record, he's got to keep things abstract, somewhat hidden, to maintain some plausible deniability, and even then, he can't escape the reality of his success, or his survivor's guilt, starkly highlighted in Star 87, produced by Conductor Williams with the dread-inducing strings, and what I could swear is the sound of an Imperial targeting computer from Star Wars in the beat, apropos from feeling trapped and hunted. And it gets all the more bleak facing the vampirism of misery, probably the underlying theme I find least compelling on the album. While the succubus is a very obviously metaphorical, it's a trope that feels a little disconnected and kind of obvious coming from Billy Woods, but the survivor's guilt interweaving with purposefully losing one's humanity leads to the genuinely horrifying Waterproof Mascara, where after hearing about his father's death as a child, his mother describes how they have to flee given some of the family members in a deliberate reference to Hiding Place's Houthi, where he then sees the psychopathy of those who marvel at pain from a distance, but also just how many try to keep stoic to stay alive, especially black men, where in the final verse amidst the weed smoke, the sobbing becomes recontextualized in the scene of Goldilocks eating from the wrong bowl, but she's the one who went to the bear's house in the first place. He's lost some of that humanity himself, sure, but why are the tears reserved for her plight, especially given the mascara's not running? Why would he even believe those are true tears? Not the first time he references a white woman's tears on A Doll Fulla Pins, amidst some surprisingly bright horns and Yolanda Williams giving him one of his cleanest ever hooks, where he's surviving and he's kind of exasperated when he's just trying to make his money, but his soul feels long gone, may have been sold before. The inhumanity is in force, and it's one of the few times the racist doll sneaks in to highlight just how much he's lost. And the fear never goes away. Because the other primary and graphic metaphor of this album is zombies. The dead that still walk, those divorced from culture, humanity ground down or expunged altogether, which becomes interesting in the context of time travel as they keep coming back no matter where you spin that dial. Pitchforks and Halos is short with the human night leading to the grinding lo-fi tap from Kenny Siegel, but it feels like one of the most consequential tracks on the album, beyond just the Aimé Césaire reference of a recontextualization of Shakespeare's final play The Tempest, where the monster Caliban finally ceases control from Prospero as an allegory for colonial powers always falling underfoot to those they try to enslave. But the line that struck me was the stirring words of dead revolutionaries who were wrong, the blurring world of all them centuries, I wonder where the time gone. The following lines highlight no matter where you leap in time, the act of doing so and actually tracing your history highlights you've made time to find that revolution for yourself, even if it has failed throughout history. But it also highlights how the zombification is such an affront to him, the living dead that exist outside of time, the fly that somehow still stays alive when trapped in the glass. And again, Billy Woods' angle is global on Black Zombie with its grainy despair, the post-colonial African states often framed as revolutionary, then suffering brain drain, rampant corruption, ruthlessly exploited by the capitalists that they previously heralded against, where the trade still done in the US dollar, where the interview with the Ugandan president is overwhelmed by the sound of flies. It's why historical context, despite getting blurred by time travel, matters. The place and people with whom you can call home, where in a personal moment he sees his kids resembling him and it breaks his heart. Or on Lead Paint Test amidst the horns, the scratching, and the pianos, the familial trauma that still lingers in a home, but is so formative to who you are, reference from both ELUCID and Cavalier. Which is why Dislocated is genuinely bleak as a closer, continuing that soulful palette. Because while Billy Woods recognizes the power of his spectacle, he's intentionally rendered himself faceless and pseudonymous. You can't know the full truth, but it's still on some level amputation from identity under the system. The title is another Frantz Fanon reference, and how he never wanted this in order to survive when they could come together and thrive. He wishes they could build together. It's why his group partner ELUCID is here asking the bigger questions. Why are we? With the line firekeeper, for this life at least. But in the moment of trauma, Billy Woods still can't quite allow himself to do the same, because he knows what may come down not just on him, but who he loves. That's a lot to untangle with this album, or what he might be trying to do, and that also leaves the unenviable task of trying to argue where it might fit in Billy Woods' catalog, and that's really hard. Because while this album might feel diffuse, many of the themes echo and reverberate from song to song, but can also lead to a listening experience that sprawls in languid, odd ways. It's certainly a tougher album to revisit than Maps. I'd also struggle to say it has the same personal, visceral gut punch moments that made Hiding Places in Church so special and poignant to me, but I also understand why to so many they're calling it his best. It's certainly in that tier. The problem with Backwoods Studios, it's a nice problem to have, is that their floor of quality is so high that while I will easily call this excellent, any differentiation in quality gets a little exaggerated, and that's not fair to a great album. I'll also say that a lot of the discourse and reviews I've seen around this are rather quite bad, largely from folks who only engage with a certain substrata of indie rap but don't interact with the culture outside of online spaces. Just feels a little voyeuristic and gross, and ironically miss the humanity that Billy Woods is trying to interrogate while showing their own ignorance of the genre, the same people who might be laughing at the pain. I am comfortable calling this album horrorcore in the same way Clipping's albums from 2019 and 2020 were, but it's also inadequate and an often misunderstood description of a complex genre with decades of history. Anyone calling this post-rap, as if hip-hop tradition has also not existed for decades in this lane, deliberately referenced on this album through multiple callbacks to the Indie Pop Consortium, Company Flow, and especially MF Doom, well, those folks should just shut up and sit in the corner. Maybe they might learn something. In any case, yeah, this album is excellent. Very easily will be among the best of 2025, and yet I can't help but feel a little bit of unease in other discourse that I've seen this spawn, in the violence of one's language and how it might be used amidst the tragedy of the story he's telling. Not surprised he found another way, something else to unnerve me after all. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. I'll admit this one took a lot to fully process. There's a lot of layers here, especially in how a diffuse structure still lends itself to so many connecting elements. But again, if you guys have your thoughts or interpretations of the project, please leave them down there below in the comments. I'm curious where y'all think this might fit in along Billy Woods' catalog. I know this will spark endless arguments, but hey, that's what the comments are for. Have fun. Beyond that though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved in helping support the channel, get albums on my schedule, which is currently open right now, it's the weekend, or hell, just getting into my Discord and arguing there, again, links to YouTube memberships and Patreon, those are open. By no means it's obligated, tough times, I understand, but hey, options available. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.